What is up, Baseball Nation? Welcome to Fan Interference, a Major League Baseball podcast where we discuss the latest news and storylines from around the league. My name is Joey, and I will be your host today. You can find me on Twitter at Major League Joey, and soon you might even find some YouTube content under the same name. This episode of the podcast, Episode 2, was recorded on August 19th, 2021. They're calling it the new steroids, a form of cheating designed to improve the performance of pitchers. It goes by the name sticky stuff, and Major League Baseball has recently started cracking down on it. If you've watched a single baseball broadcast this year, you've already seen pitchers get inspected by umpires at the conclusion of every half inning. The umps, well, they're looking for foreign substances wherever they can check. They are searching players' caps, belt buckles, gloves, you name it. But what is sticky stuff? How does it help the player? And who has it seemingly helped the most? Does it have any place in our game? That is what is coming up next on Fan Interference. So Major League Baseball seems to have a sticky situation on their hands. Another major cheating scandal that comes on the heels of the Red Sox sign-stealing scandal, which came on the heels of the Astros cheating scandal, which came on the heels of the biogenesis scandal, which came on the heels of the steroids scandal, and then the 1985 cocaine and amphetamine scandal, which came on the heels of the Pete Rose gambling scandal, which... Okay, I'll stop there. Baseball has had a lot of cheating in its history. But rather than relive the past, let's talk about the present. What even is this sticky stuff, and what does it even do in terms of the competitive nature of the game? Well, you know how I just said, rather than relive the past, let's talk about the present? Sort of lied. There's no way to discuss the sticky stuff without talking about the history of the game, because the history of the game is intertwined with the use of sticky stuff. This is nothing new, folks. Doctored baseballs is about as MLB as a $10 hot dog at Yankee Stadium, or a mic'd up athlete saying the F word live on nationally syndicated television. Historically, sticky stuff has come in various forms. We've seen pine tar used. There's the rosin bag that, of course, every pitcher has access to. Players would spit on the ball to smooth it out. And it's even against the rules to rough up a baseball because pitchers used to cheat back in the day by scratching up the surface of the ball to create more turbulence in the air resistance. For a while there, I think I can at least speak for myself, I didn't realize that this was still a major issue. I didn't realize the frequency with which pitchers were taking sunscreen that was applied to their skin, mixing it with sweat from their forehead, and then touching the rosin bag to create artificial sticky stuff on their fingers. But recently the pitchers have taken it to a brand new height, a whole new level, through the use of a new product called Spider Tack. Spider Tack is a competitive grade paste initially designed for strongman competitions where athletes would lift Atlas stones. Yeah, that's right. Lifting competitions where 5 Atlas stones would have to be lifted to a new physical height, and the stones themselves, they ranged from 220 to 260 pounds, so you could probably imagine that this is some insanely powerful tacky. But what does it do to improve grip, and what does improved grip even mean? to answer this question requires a bit of physics, so please bear with me as we get into something that maybe you haven't thought about in many, many years. When a baseball is flying through the air, there are 4 forces that act on it. 3 of them you probably intuitively know and understand, and the 4th one is going to be a major variable in this equation that we need to understand if we're going to continue to have a conversation about why sticky stuff is the most egregious form of cheating that exists in the current game. The first force that acts on a baseball that's flying through the air is known as the velocity vector. You can simply think of this as the throw itself. The ball moves forward from the pitcher towards the catcher, along an arrow called the velocity vector. The second force at play is something that you're no stranger to. You've seen it and experienced it your entire life. It's gravitational pull. Constantly, a force is pulling down on the ball and bringing it closer to the ground at 9.8 meters per second squared. The third force is known as drag. This is simply the presence of air and wind resistance, slowing the pitch's velocity over time. These 3 forces should seem intuitive enough. But the final force is the most important one for understanding how pitchers are exploiting sticky stuff to beat batters. And they're beating batters on a regular basis because of this. Fundamentally, sticky stuff is a problem because of a physics phenomenon known as the Magnus Force. Now, what is the Magnus Force? It's a force that exerts pressure perpendicular to any object that's passing through the air. If the object has topspin, the pressure is downward. You can think about how a tennis player applies topspin to create something known as a drop shot. If you've ever played tennis with somebody who's maybe a little bit more skilled than you, even if you're more agile and you have more speed than them, and maybe you're giving more effort, sometimes it doesn't matter. If they're able to create topspin at a faster rate than you can, sometimes they just drop shot the ball right over the net and the ball bounces twice before you can even get to it. That's a Magnus effect. Conversely, if the object has backspin, the force is applied in the upward direction. For this, you can think of, let's say, a golfer. Golfers purposefully create backspin in order to give a golf ball what we call lift. It increases the hang time of the ball in the air. And by the time the ball hits the ground, if there's enough backspin, sometimes the ball starts moving backwards in the same direction of where the golfer was. Now, baseball players can exploit the Magnus effect even more so by holding the ball in a particular arm slot with the stitches rotated to be at various angles. This allows for the Magnus effect to be imposed either partially or fully on an east to west basis, from the outside corner of the plate to the inside corner of the plate. Thus, a player can achieve additional horizontal movement on two-seam fastballs, cutters, sinkers, sliders, and curves. You name it. Any pitch with horizontal movement, now we can artificially create more and more. If we can control the Magnus effect, and we can get even more force out of the Magnus effect, we can get even more movement on our pitches. The interaction of air on the baseball and its seams plays a major role in producing more or less Magnus Force. And more or less Magnus Force equals more or less movement. And there lies the reality. The better one's grip, the more rotation. The more Magnus effect, the more movement. The more movement, the more strikeouts, ground balls, and or flyouts a pitcher can reasonably expect. And that means better performance. Better performance means a bigger paycheck. There is a big incentive on an individual basis for pitchers to use this ticky-tacky in order to get just a bit more movement on their pitches. And the teams, well, they don't mind, because they're doing it as well, and they're benefiting from it. Teams are getting wins that they otherwise wouldn't get. They're getting production out of players that normally wouldn't give them that level of production. Why would they complain? It seems as if everyone sort of likes it. Except for the fans, who are interested in seeing a bit more offense and a bit less no-hitters. We've seen a record high amount of no-hitters this year. We've seen no-hitters coming out of people that we would never expect to see no-hitters. An aging Corey Kluber threw one on May 19th. Recently, the Arizona Diamondbacks had a rookie pitcher in his first ever start, and he threw a no-hitter. The Magnus effect is something to consider. Sticky stuff has a potentially large impact on the ability for pitchers to get these sort of outcomes, and particularly before June 2nd, the number of no-hitters that we've seen, sky high. So if improved grip equals higher spin rate, what is better about higher spin rate than lower ones? A 2012 published study at the National Center for Biotechnology Information entitled "The Effect of Fastball Backspin Rate on Baseball Hitting Accuracy" explored this very concept. The study used 2 high-speed video cameras to observe 13 professional, semi-professional, and college varsity baseball players as they attempted to hit fastballs of the same velocity with different spin rates. The study found a positive correlation between fastball spin rate and increases in the distance from the optimal contact spot of a swung bat to the actual point of contact. In other words, they basically found out that it was really hard to get the sweet spot of a bat on the baseball when pitchers are throwing higher spin rates. The effect was the following. High spin rates equals more swing and misses. High spin rates also equal more weak fly balls and pop outs. And of course, fly balls are some of the easiest defensive outs to make. But what about normal spin rates? Well, normal spin rates actually equated to the easiest conditions for a batter to make solid contact. And this shouldn't be too surprising. For a batter's entire life, they've mostly been batting against average pitchers. Most of the time, they've developed a skill set and they've developed an approach at the plate that addresses the quality of pitches that you would see from an average pitcher. And that just happens to align with average spin rate. What about lower spin rates? Well, interestingly enough, having a lower spin rate typically increases the total instances of contact. However, most of those contacts end up being ground balls. And although ground balls can easily result in an out, and that's why lower spin rates typically lead to better results than average spin rates, but a ground ball is also more likely to result in a single or an error than, say, a pop-out 240 feet away from home plate. So, as it appears, high spin rates are the best, low spin rates are the second best, and average spin rates are the worst. But maybe studies aren't convincing enough for you. Maybe that's too, quote-unquote, theoretical. The findings of this study were actually consistent with real data observed in the following baseball season of 2013. Zach Day, a writer for the Baseball Prospectus, had a fantastic article in December of 2013. And in the article, he shows, using real MLB data that more spin rate equated to a massive increase in swings and misses. Now, this is my personal favorite factoid. When I saw this, it kind of blew my mind. I mean, I knew that this was a good player. I knew at this particular point in his career that he was a great player. Believe me, as a Yankee fan, you can't avoid the fact that this was a good player at this point in time. But I didn't realize just how good this particular closer was. Take the Boston Red Sox closer, Koji Uehara, who had an average RPM in the year 2013, the year of this study, and the year of the data that we are observing in relation to the study. He had an average RPM that year of more than 10% greater than the major league average. And the results speak for themselves. His ERA was 1.09. He was just filthy. He gave up 33 hits and 9 walks in over 74 innings pitched. He struck out more than 100 batters, which was good for 12.2 strikeouts per 9 innings. By the way, that's more strikeouts per 9 than Jacob deGrom had in either of his 2 Cy Young Award-winning seasons. Koji Uehara's whip was 0.565 that year. These are historical numbers. These are the sort of numbers you see on baseballreference.com when you're looking at iconic all-time greats. And for one season, Koji Uehara had that level of production. It just so happened that happened to be the year where he had the most RPM of his entire career. I can keep going on and on, but I think you get the point. Improved grip equals higher spin rate, which equals more swings and misses, which equals better pitching, both in the theoretical and in actual real-world data. Now, there's one caveat I've got to make here. There is a place for low spin rate. Pitchers who primarily pitch to the lower part of the zone and look to induce ground balls actually may benefit from their low spin rate. A really good example of this is Kyle Hendricks of the Chicago Cubs. You've heard of him. He's no slouch. He's a well above average quality pitcher with a very strong career under his belt. Kyle Hendricks was one of the absolute worst pitchers in all of baseball when it came to fastball spin rate. And honestly, it didn't really hurt him at all. You could make an argument that it improved his outcomes. Why? Because he effectively combined his low spin rate with an emphasis on a location low in the zone to purposefully induce weak ground ball contact. In 2020, Kyle Hendricks had an ERA of 2.88 with a sub-1 whip. The only arguable blemish on his stat line was actually something that we would expect to see. His strikeouts per 9 were sort of low. But that was by design. I mean, we even previously discussed how high spin rates equals more swings and misses. Low spin rates typically increase total instances of contact. So him having a low strikeouts per 9 is nothing we wouldn't expect to see. In fact, if you look at his last 5 seasons, he's seemingly gotten worse at strikeouts per 9, while, with the exception of this most recent season, he has continuously gotten better and better production in the areas of ERA, in the area of whip, FIP, and all the other metrics that we use to evaluate the quality of a pitcher. Oh yeah, and he also ended 9th in Cy Young voting last year, despite being in the 1 percentile for spin rate. So yes, I had to put that caveat out there. It's true that spin rate isn't the only thing, and spin rate doesn't 100% correlate with being a good pitcher. There are examples of pitchers who utilize low spin rate in order to get outcomes that are truly remarkable. But the general rule is that high spin rate equals good performance. Okay, now the fun part, the speculative part. This is the gossip section. Think Mean Girls, which is, by the way, a first ballot Hall of Fame movie. Which players saw the largest decreases in spin rates after Major League Baseball started to crack down on the cheating, starting June 2nd of this year? The New York Times investigated this question, and recently they came out with a list of 14 different players that had large raw spin changes, as well as velocity-adjusted changes that were indicative of big decreases in spin rate. We've got a pitcher from the Oakland Athletics. We've got Trevor Bauer, Garrett Richards from the Boston Red Sox, Dylan Cease, Walker Buehler, Garrett Cole of the Yankees, Corbin Burns, who's been having a magical season, Casey Mize, who's a great up-and-coming young pitcher in the Tigers organization, Drew Smyly, and a few others. And if we look at these players, many of them had ERAs before the crackdown of 3 or less. After the crackdown, well, most of their ERAs went up. Now, there are some exceptions. A notable one would be Walker Buehler, who his ERA before the crackdown was 2.82, and now it's 2.09. Which makes it even more amazing, because if you consider the fact that Walker Buehler is a pitcher who was also, not too long ago, recovering from Tommy John surgery, what he's been able to accomplish is unbelievable. And of course, Corbin Burns, he went from a 2.24 ERA before the crackdown, and he's down to, as of this recording, a 2.13 ERA. So it's not impossible to see your ERA go down. Drew Smyly saw that fact pattern, but most of the pitchers that have had a decrease in their spin rate have seen their ERA go up by a lot. How do we quantify this? If we just take a simple average ERA of all the players in the top 14 who saw a decrease in their spin rates, the simple average ERA, 3.45 before the crackdown. A 3.45 ERA is a very solid ERA. That is a quality pitcher. After the crackdown, slightly over 3.7. Still a usable pitcher. By no means did these pitchers go from being elite to forgetting how to play. But certainly they saw a decrease in the effectiveness of their pitching. So why did we see a 7 to 10% decrease in the productivity of some of the game's best pitchers? Ask yourself, does going from a 3.7 ERA to a 3.45 ERA make a pitcher much more attractive to you? I know it does for me. The difference between a 3.7 ERA and a 3.45 ERA on paper doesn't seem that big, but in reality, I think that's a pretty sizable difference in the quality of the player. When Garrett Richards had a 3.75 ERA before the crackdown, his $8.5 million salary seemed like a steal for a franchise that's accustomed to paying premiums for top talent. That's a steal. But now that his ERA is over 5 after the crackdown, it looks like a theft in the opposite direction. And when Garrett Cole had a 1.78 ERA for the Yankees, you were probably thinking he was on the fast track to a Cy Young award. But now he has the same ERA as Corey Kluber. There's no doubt that other factors play a role here. But to ignore the elephant in the room, that was the sticky stuff, just seems silly. In my opinion, the MLB is doing the right thing. Fans want more offense. I, for one, am sick and tired of hearing how baseball is too boring a sport. But that's a topic for a different day. Well, I thank you for listening to today's podcast. Today was August 19th, 2021. It was the second episode of Fan Interference, a Major League Baseball podcast where we discuss the latest news and storylines from around the league. My name is Joey. You can find me on Twitter at Major League Joey, and perhaps soon there might be some YouTube content coming out under the same name. I thank you so much, and until next time.